What does it mean?
ADHD?
Yeah, what is it exactly? Is it real?
Oh, it's real.
What?
Is that the medical profession and a lot of the so-called experts think about it as a disease, another one of these inherited diseases. In fact, they say it's the most heritable mental illness there is. And I say it's neither an illness nor is it heritable. So the hallmark are difficulty paying attention when you're not motivated.
Yes.
So kind of tuning out, like that kid in the commercial.
Like me.
Okay. Poor impulse control, so that you tend to act out whatever emotion arises. And sometimes the hyperactivity, difficulty sitting still and having to fidget and all that. And that described me to a T. What is it? So tuning out is not a disease. So let me ask you a question, if I may.
Okay.
If I were to stress you right now, create stress, emotional difficulty or tension for you right now, what would be your options of dealing with that?
Yeah.
You could fight back, flight or fight, yeah? But what if you didn't have those options?
Yeah, then you're stuck.
And what does the brain do when you're stuck like that?
Gets distracted.
It gets tunes out.
Yeah, it tunes out. You want to do other things, think about other things.
In other words, it's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Infants can't help but absorb the stress of their parents.
Right.
They can't help it. What does an infant do? Could I have escaped or fought back? Could you have? All we could do is tune out.
Yes.
But when is this tuning out happening? When our brain is being developed.
Right.
And our brain, this is the part that nobody taught me in medical school, but it turns out that brain science now teaches us that the human brain develops under the impact of the environment. So the most salient feature of the environment that shapes the circuits of the human brain is actually the relationship with the parents. And if the parents are present and emotionally attuned and available, the child brains develop properly. But the parents are stressed, the child absorbs the stress. What can they do with it? They tune out. And that tuning out thing is programmed into the brain. And then 10 years later or 50 years later, we say, you got this disease. No, you don't. You've got a coping mechanism that's no longer working for you. But it had a function when it first came along. So this whole idea, and by the way, if a family comes to me with their ADHD child, I'll say to them, what you've got here is a very sensitive child. That sensitive child is picking up on all the vibes, energies, and stresses in your family. You want to help this child? Deal with the whole family. Look at the parental relationship. Look at what stress is there in your life. Look at how you react to the child. Do you understand the child's behavior or the emotions that the child is having, or are you just trying to control the child's behaviors? Look at all that. And very often parents will tell me after they've read that book on ADHD, they've totally changed their relationship to their child. The child changes. What a surprise.
Hello, everyone. I'm Russ Barkley, and this is a commentary on whether or not early trauma, physical or emotional, contributes to or even causes ADHD in children. I get asked this question a lot, particularly lately, especially since people like Gabor Mate have appeared on Joe Rogan, and others have been making claims that the majority of cases of ADHD arise from early childhood traumatic events. So let's talk about this and see if we can make sense out of the voluminous scientific literature that would apply to this question. I also want to point out that in my experience, many people making these claims have no scientific standing within the field of ADHD. That is, they haven't done any research or published anything, and therefore don't appear to be very familiar with the substantial literature on the etiologies of ADHD. They go about making these very strong but highly unempirical claims about ADHD, when if they simply took the time to go into Google Scholar and to read the thousands of research papers on the causes of ADHD, they would probably have a very different opinion. So, apart from this kind of scientific laziness, shall we call it, let's go and discuss this topic of trauma and ADHD. Now, there is no question that children with ADHD may experience higher rates of emotional trauma, physical trauma, and even sexual trauma or abuse. So we need to distinguish among these different kinds of trauma because they may have different roles to play in causing or exacerbating ADHD. So for instance, there's no evidence that early emotional trauma alone, that is being exposed to distressing events, leads to later ADHD symptoms. There's just no compelling evidence that I've seen for that. Longitudinal studies simply don't support. So we have a young couple here. They've given birth to this child. As this child grows up, they're going to become an ADHD, active, inattentive, impulsive child. Now, since relationships are bidirectional, we know that there is a direct effect of this child and their behavior on the way these young parents are going to react to this child. So we have a nice bidirectional influence here in parent-child relationships. And indeed, some people have made the argument, convincing in my opinion, that children have more effects on how their caregivers interact and relate to them than caregivers have on the children's behavior. But that also doesn't ignore the fact that it's a two-way street. Regardless of how much influence or effect you want to place on either side of the equation, it's a two-way street. Now, let's suppose that this young child turns out to be ADHD, in fact. Well, they're going to be emitting higher rates of disruptive behavior, hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive, distractible, emotional. All the symptoms of ADHD, of course, are going to be occurring at a much greater frequency than we would see in a typical child. So there's going to be a lot more behavior being thrown at these parents that they're going to have to cope with. And what we see among parents is that over time, parents increase their efforts to control this child's behavior, to dampen it down, to bring it within normal variation, to make the child more compliant with requests and tasks. But because ADHD is not due to the social environment, ADHD doesn't arise from bad parenting, the parent's efforts are going to have minimal effect on the ADHD because its origins are not social. The origin of ADHD is neurological and genetic. And consequently, alterations in parenting aren't going to get rid of it. Even if they may help to cope with it and dampen it down a bit, it doesn't eliminate it. So now let's take a look at the fact that about 20 to 35% of parents of ADHD children have the same disorder themselves. It's a highly genetic disorder. So if a child has it, there's a good bet that if it's of the genetic type, which most ADHD is, the parent, one or both of them, is going to have ADHD also. Now, what happens when an ADHD child is raised in a family where one of the parents has ADHD? Well, now this parent is going to be throwing at this child a lot more high rates of behavior, emotional, impulsive, inattentive, and so on, back at the child who's already ADHD. What do you think that's going to do to this child's behavior? It's going to increase their disruptive behavior. And indeed, one of the chief causes of oppositional defiant disorder in children with ADHD is that their parents have the same disorder, and it's disrupting the parenting that is therefore leading to the increase in the odds of defiant arguments, oppositional, stubborn behavior, irritability, and so on that are all part of ODD. So now we've got an ADHD child with another disorder, ODD. What's that going to do? The ODD is going to start throwing more defiant, conflicted, emotional, hostile, angry, argumentative behavior back at these parents. Even typical parents would find that hard to deal with, and that would increase rates of expressed emotion, hostility, and if you want to, you can classify that as emotionally traumatizing to the child. But notice that it's being done in reaction to a child who is dysregulated, who has poor self-control, who is very disruptive and hard to manage. And parents are grasping at ways of trying to manage and cope with this child. And of course, their own high rates of emotional behavior are going to worsen the child's behavior.